There are horror stories that make you crawl underneath your blanket and struggle with insomnia. There are stories that make you gasp. And then there are stories that make your skin crawl and make you question the very fiber of mankind. Have you ever heard of a fetish? A kink? A nasty fantasy? This is one of those stories. The story of two people. Man and wife who have lived, loved, and been together for over 50 years. But what happens when everything you thought was real is nothing but an illusion? This is the story of Richard and Margaret Thompson, a couple who had been married for 53 years. To the outside world, they were the definition of devotion. People envied their love, praised their commitment, and saw them as proof that true romance still existed. But no one, not even Margaret herself, could have imagined the dark secret that was hiding beneath the rugs of her own home. Richard was a man of peace. He was calm and kind and a highly successful entrepreneur who built a successful business from the ground up until his retirement. Together, they had 4 kids and 8 grandchildren, and long before retirement, they both relocated to their country home in Alabama, where Richard bought Margaret the house of her dreams. Margaret was the kind of woman who could light up a room without saying a word. She was loving and kind and very supportive of her family. Before she retired, she'd worked with many schools and institutions as a guidance counselor. At 74, she was finally ready to live out her years with the one man she loved the most. Richard. One thing Margaret loved more than knitting was volunteer work, and shortly after retirement, she began to volunteer whoever she could. To everyone who knew the Thompsons, they all knew Margaret was the heart of the family. But tell me, have you ever looked at a couple and wondered what their life is really like when no one is watching? Richard had always been a man of routine. He worked long hours, traveled frequently, and spent time with his wife. Do you believe that love can make people blind? Because Margaret did. And that blindness would cost her everything. And it all happened one night that changed everything. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. Margaret was at home, reading in the library, waiting for Richard to return from a business trip. But he never made it home that night. Instead, police officers arrived at the estate. Margaret was confused. Her husband was a quiet man. What could the police possibly want with him? Had there been an accident? Had something happened on his trip? But then, they said the words that made her entire world collapse. Richard had been arrested. And not just for anything. He had been caught propositioning an underage girl. Margaret couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. The officers continued, explaining how Richard had been under surveillance for months after a 14-year-old reported his case. She wanted to believe it was a mistake. A misunderstanding. But the police weren't finished. Because what they had come to tell her was far worse than she could have imagined. They had searched Richard's belongings after his arrest, combed through his records, and uncovered things that no wife should ever have to see. Evidence that would destroy the very foundation of their marriage. And in that moment, Margaret realized something horrifying. She had spent her entire life sleeping beside a stranger. The man she loved, the man she trusted, the man she devoted 53 years of her life to, had been living a double life. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? To wake up one day and realize that everything you thought was true, was a lie. The moment the officers showed Margaret the evidence, she thought she was going to collapse. Her mind couldn't wrap around the reality of what they were saying, what they were showing her. But when they led her to Richard's study and opened the laptop, that's when everything shattered. They had found it. Hundreds of videos. Videos of herself with 600 strange men. None of whom she could recall, none but one. These videos weren't shot in a hotel room, or some exotic vacation spot. No, these videos were filmed in her own home. In her own bed. The place where she had felt the most comfortable, the most secure. The place she had slept every night for the past 6 years. The images on the screen were beyond anything she could have imagined. There were scenes of her lying unconscious, her eyes closed, oblivious to the horrors around her as these strange men raped her. Over and over and over again. Each video had a different man. Each man defiled her. She had no memory of any of it. How could she? She never consented to any of it. She couldn't even recognize the men. Strange faces. Men she had never seen before. The footage wasn't just from one night. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. There were 600 of these videos. All taken over the years. All hidden underneath the rug in Richard's study, in their home. Her home. Her sanctuary. She felt sick to her stomach. How could she have never known? How could she have never seen the signs? And that's when she told the officers about the strange illness she'd been battling for the last 16 months. It had started innocently enough. She had begun to feel tired, more than usual. She thought it was the result of her age. After all, she was in her 70s now, and with age came the expected aches and pains. But it didn't stop there. Margaret started to notice gaps in her memory. She would wake up in the mornings feeling disoriented, confused, unsure of how she had spent the night. At first, she brushed it off. The doctors said she was perfectly healthy. They said it was just a part of growing older, a sign of the natural aging process. But there was always this nagging feeling, a suspicion she couldn't shake. Every time she woke up, it felt like she was waking up from a dream she couldn't quite remember. And as time passed, it only got worse. There were nights when she would wake up with bruises she couldn't explain, marks on her body that she couldn't remember getting. There were nights when she felt strange, disoriented, almost as if she wasn't in control of her own actions. It wasn't until the officers had shown her the videos that everything clicked into place. Richard had been drugging her. For how long? How many years had this been going on? Margaret couldn't even begin to process it. She had trusted him. She had loved him. She had believed that they had a perfect marriage. But now, as she looked at the evidence, she realized that everything she thought she knew was a lie. Richard hadn't just been hiding these videos. No, he had been the one orchestrating everything. He had been drugging her food, her drinks, and slipping something into her nightly medication. The very medication she had been taking to calm her nerves, to help with the memory loss she thought was a natural part of aging. But it wasn't natural. It was poison. Richard had been using that to his advantage for years, recording these videos of her being taken advantage of by men she didn't know. And what was worse, Richard hadn't just stopped with her. The videos weren't just of her. Out of the 600 footages, 7 were of her granddaughter, Sylvia. Their precious granddaughter, who had visited them every summer since she was a child. The girl who had always been so full of life, so trusting, so innocent. Margaret's heart ached just thinking about it. But as the officers showed her the videos, she realized the unthinkable had happened. Richard had involved their granddaughter in his twisted games. The girl, innocent and unaware, had been drugged just like Margaret. And in these videos, there she was, the little girl Margaret was taken advantage of by strange men, just like Margaret herself. Sylvia was only 12 years old. How could Richard have done this? How could he have betrayed not just his wife, but his own flesh and blood? It was all too much to bear. Asked what she thought caused this, she called a memory she tried hard to bury. 3 years ago, Richard suggested something that Margaret never thought would be a turning point in their marriage. It was a casual conversation at first, as he brought up the idea of introducing a foursome into their marriage. At first, it seemed like a suggestion that seemed innocent enough at the time. He had a friend coming into Alabama, who had recently married his new wife. Richard claimed that his friend and his wife were looking for ways to spice up their marriage, and he was eager to be a part of it. At first, Margaret was taken aback. The very idea felt foreign to her. In her 70s, she didn't think she wanted to entertain such notions, and when Richard suggested it, her first instinct was to shut it down. "I'm not interested in getting involved in something like that," she told him firmly. Richard, ever the charmer, didn't press. He didn't argue, and Margaret, though wary, felt a sense of relief that he had let it drop. But little did she know, the seeds had already been planted. Over time, Richard began to change. The man she had loved for so many years wasn't the same. He had started spending more time away from home, more time with friends, more time in places where he shouldn't have been. It wasn't long before Margaret began to feel the distance between them. Then, 8 months later, the bombshell came. Margaret had gone out to run some errands and pick up groceries. But as she was leaving the grocery store, she spotted something that made her heart drop into her stomach. Richard's car was parked near the entrance. There, sitting in the front seat, was Richard, and he wasn't alone. Margaret narrated how she saw him kissing a woman. She couldn't believe it. The woman was a grocery store attendant, someone who was clearly younger than Margaret. That evening, after Richard had come home and tried to apologize, Margaret couldn't hold back the tears any longer. She let him know how deeply he had hurt her. "I thought I was giving you everything you needed, Richard," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was doing enough, but you don't even value me. You don't respect me." Richard, of course, promised her that it would never happen again. He seemed genuinely sorry, regretful, and he promised to do better. He said he would change, that this was a one-time mistake, and that nothing like it would happen again. For a brief moment, Margaret believed him. He had always been good at saying the right things, at making her believe that he was the man she had married, the man she had spent a lifetime with. Determined to fix things, Margaret took the initiative. She started dressing differently, wearing clothes that were more flattering, more youthful. She put effort into her appearance, thinking that maybe, just maybe, it would rekindle the spark they had lost. She made sure to initiate lovemaking more often, hoping that it would bring them closer again. For a while, it seemed to work. Richard acted more affectionate, more attentive. He apologized repeatedly for his mistake, saying that he'd been out of line, that he was lucky to have a wife like Margaret. He even seemed to be more present in their relationship, making small gestures of affection. Margaret allowed herself to believe that the worst was behind them. She thought the situation had been fixed. She thought they were back on track. But little did she know, Richard wasn't just lying to her. Behind her back, he had already started something much worse. Months passed, and Margaret's health continued to decline. The memory issues persisted, and she had started to feel more and more exhausted. Margaret felt disconnected from her own body. She had gone to the doctor, but the tests came back clean, nothing was physically wrong with her. But there was still the lingering exhaustion, the strange memory lapses, the feelings of dizziness. But Richard was always beside her during the hospital visits, and he didn't fail to remind her to take her medications before bed. It wasn't until Margaret joined a small counseling group for children with autism that Margaret found something that gave her purpose. Helping those children gave her a sense of accomplishment. something that made her feel like she was still capable, still strong despite everything that had been happening with her health. She threw herself into the work, attending the group sessions and helping the children. When she wasn't there, she spent her time resting, trying to recover from the fatigue that seemed to consume her every waking moment. Richard, ever the supportive husband, took care of her. He would make her coffee in the mornings, help her with her medication, and drive her to her counseling sessions. Margaret believed, in those moments, that perhaps they were finally finding their rhythm again. She never suspected the truth. Richard seemed like the perfect husband. He was always there, always caring, always attentive. It was hard to imagine that this man, the one who held her hand, who drove her to her appointments, could also be the same man who had taken advantage of her in the most bizarre manner. But now, as the truth started to unfold, Margaret couldn't deny it anymore. The truth about Richard's betrayal was more than she could ever have imagined. Not one, not two, but 600 different men took advantage of her. All strangers. Men she'd never seen nor could she recall. But then, one video caught her eye. She recognized the man in the video. It was their neighbor. The man had moved out of the neighborhood just a few weeks ago. The video had been taken about 7 months ago, back when he had still been living across the street. Margaret could barely believe it. This was the man she had seen walking his dog, the man who had waved to her from his front porch, the man who she had briefly exchanged pleasantries with on a few occasions. How could this man be in her home, on her bed, having sex with her? Richard had orchestrated all of it. He had brought these men into their home, into their private space, and recorded every moment. In his confession, Richard narrated that he had ensured that the men undressed in the kitchen so they wouldn't leave any personal belongings in the bedroom. They were all strangers. Many of them homeless, very young or elderly, ranging from their early 20s to their 70s. Men she had never met, men she couldn't recognize, each one performing unspeakable acts while she lay unconscious, completely unaware. And Richard, her husband, had watched and videoed it all. When the police eventually started their investigation, they arrested 32 of the suspects and each confessed to the crime. They all shared a similar confession. The men were paid in cash, never given any personal information, and told never to speak a word of what happened. Richard would meet them in secret locations, hand them money, and bring them into his home, always making sure that Margaret was asleep first. But the most horrifying aspect of it all was that Richard had done this in plain sight, under the guise of being the perfect husband. He had convinced Margaret that he was caring for her, that he was supporting her in her sickness, that he was the loving spouse she had always known. But in reality, he had been orchestrating one of the most grotesque scenarios imaginable. The police were shocked by the scope of the crime. They continued to gather evidence, cross-checking the men who had been arrested, but what Margaret knew for certain now was that her entire life had been a lie. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, had been using her, exploiting her, and turning their life into a sickening theater for his own pleasure. While the footage dated back to 1.5 years ago, Margaret couldn't help but wonder how long this had been going on. How many years had she spent in the dark, unknowingly living with a monster? How many moments had she shared with Richard, thinking he was her protector, when all along he had been the one hurting her, causing her ill health with the drugs and taking advantage of her? But it didn't just end with Margaret. Richard's own daughter, Kathy, wanted justice for her 12-year-old daughter too. Sylvia had been molested by 8 men while she was unconscious, and Richard had also paid them heavily for this. No one understood why. Up until this day, Richard faced his verdict without telling the court why he did the things he did. He was called a sociopath. He was called a madman. But in all this, Richard Thompson claimed he still loved his wife and wanted her to be happy. Had he perhaps done this thinking I'm some twisted way that it would please her? How long did he wish to continue before he ran out of luck? If this was his family, his own wife, his own grandkid, who else had Richard Thompson hurt in this mindless game? And how far can a man go to satisfy his inner demons? How far can a man go to play out his fantasies? For 76-year-old Richard Thompson, he was willing to pay the price of trust, family, and money just to live his fantasy every day for the past 600 days. Whole Margaret believes she pushed him by refusing his proposal to spice things up years ago. Many couldn't help but ask how Sylvia had gotten into the picture. What had his grandkid done to qualify as a player in this sick game? And who else out there had Richard Thompson hurt before the police finally put an end to his dark games? Was he ever going to tell Margaret the truth? Was 600 videos going to be enough for the old man? Or was he just getting started?